lunch break. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm Oscar at Thompson, the Head of Policy and Communications at the UKSIF, with a membership network for sustainable finance in the UK. It's a real pleasure to be moderating this discussion today. We'll be talking about regulatory change in the financial services sector in the UK, with a particular focus on the government's Edinburgh Reforms and subsequent Mansion House reforms that were announced by government earlier this summer. We've got three brilliant speakers to lead us through the conversation over the next 45 minutes or so. Starting in order, we've got Caroline Escott, who's a senior investment manager at Railpen. Caroline oversees Railpen stewardship and corporate governance work across Railpen's global portfolio. Next to Caroline, we have Kimberly Lewis. Kim is the head of active ownership at Schroders. And last but not least, we have Michael Moore, the chief executive of the British Private Equity Capital Association, which is the industry body. Sorry. No worries. They are the industry body for the private equity and venture capital industry in the UK. So, first of all, thanks so much for joining me on the panel today. Lots to discuss and get through. I suppose to provide a little bit of context quickly to people in the audience for a discussion. Edinburgh Reforms were a pretty meaty package of financial services measures that were announced by the government last December, all really centered around these themes of kind of driving growth and competitiveness in the UK's financial services and investment industries. Following that, you have the Mansion House reforms, which very much built on some of the measures announced in the Edinburgh Reforms, and that gave, I think, a bit more kind of meat on the bone, so to speak, in terms of incentives for companies to invest, expand and grow in the UK. We saw some changes to the UK's regime for listings as well, and I think there was a particular focus in the Mansion House reforms early in the summer around kind of trying to unlock pension scheme capital into high growth industries and businesses. I guess to start with you, Caroline, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the effects of the measures that were announced at the Edinburgh Reforms, the subsequent Mansion House reforms, and then perhaps also bring kind of Railpen's perspective as a global asset owner into this.
Thank you very much, Oscar. It's great to be here today. I will give actually a few more details about Railpen, as you suggest, because I think it helps set the context for some of what I'm going to say and what we'll be discussing later in the panel. So we are unusual amongst UK pension schemes in a number of ways. The first is that we have many open defined benefit sections. We have about £35 billion of assets under management, which means that, again, unlike many other UK pension schemes or DB pension schemes, we have a very long-term mindset. So we are oriented to growth assets. We have about 52%, I think, in listed equity. We have about 20% dedicated to private markets. That includes VC and private equity. And we reckon about £6.5 billion of that is dedicated to what has been termed by various bits of the government as productive finance. We also have a dedicated pre-IPO portfolio. We're also unusual in that we have internalised our asset management since 2013. So we manage the majority of our assets in-house. We use some external managers, particularly for some of the more niche asset classes, but we will be continuing to internalise that going forward. And to us, that matters because it allows us to be nimble. It allows us to look through directly to the assets under management as well. And the final piece that I'll say, because it is really relevant to this debate about capital markets, is that, again, unlike some investors and contrary to what some of the debates on this issue would imply, we are actually overweight UK quite substantially. We are underweight US. And that is for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is because we recognise that generally when you invest in a UK listed company, you're investing in something which benefits from a regulatory framework that at present maintains high corporate governance standards and robust investor protections. So to your proper question, but hopefully that's useful context. We think that generally there's a lot that's good in some of the Mansion House reforms. We see for ourselves the benefits that scale brings in terms of the internalisation, in terms of the building of expertise, in terms of being able to put downward pressure on fees from the external asset managers that we do use. I've mentioned previously that we have a very risk-oriented mindset, and we have no doubt that part of that and part of our ability to act on that comes from the scales. So the measures to improve consolidation, I think, will be beneficial, although there are some pragmatic issues to be overcome, and not every scheme is the same. Even every DB scheme is the same, not even every closed DB scheme is the same. And the other piece that I'd mention is that we are supportive of any measures which seek to open up opportunities to pension schemes to invest in assets that might make sense for their membership. and sensible member outcomes. And it's that sensible member outcomes piece that I think is really important. We're really supportive of the fact that many of these measures, proposals have been voluntary. You cannot cut across trustees' fiduciary duty to invest in members' best interest.
Fantastic. Thanks for kicking us off. Turning to you, Kimberly, any thoughts on anything Caroline said? And I guess more broadly, going back to the question of how optimistic are, I guess, you and Schroders in terms of the effectiveness, I guess, of these reforms really getting pension scheme capital, putting that money on behalf of savers to work in the real economy?
Sure. So overall, we welcome the reforms. We welcome sort of any attempt to sort of look at the problem and sort of acknowledge that we've all heard the stats about new listings and the impact that it's having on the economy. I really want to sort of pick up on Caroline's point around strong governance, and that sort of to give a bit of context of my role. I lead the stewardship team here at Schroders. We are an active manager. We engage actively across all asset classes, including private equities, credit, sovereigns. And we place a tremendous amount of resource and importance on the conversations that we have with the companies on our holdings on governance issues. It has played particularly so the aspect of the Edinburgh Reforms that particularly sort of touches because there's so many, right? They're so fragmented. There's how many, 30, 40, 50. So
yeah.
I'd like to sort of just focus on so really sort of focusing on really focusing on the primary markets effectiveness review. I think that touches our sort of world the most, and sort of looking at the listing rules and looking at the listing rules fresh. This is something that both as a active manager, but also as an issuer and as a member of the FTSE 100 is something that is of interest to us. One thing about the debate so we welcome the reforms. We have really, really excited to see the FCA making some sort of bold moves. I'm really questioning whether more rules is really the answer, whether a more prescriptive regime. And that seems to be the direction that we're going in some ways. The corporate governance code, the stewardship code, and the listing rule, have this sort of been a bit of a kind of death by 1,000 cuts in a way, right? There's not, I think, one individual element that's particularly problematic, but if you look at, and we engage globally, and I used to engage primarily US companies. Right. If you look at the regime and you look at the level of prescription and regulations that particularly a newly issued or small mid-cap company in the UK has to, the ecosystem that it is sitting under, there's a very strong argument that it is a lot more prescriptive. And I think that it is potentially a real concern that could impact companies choosing to list here. So I'm glad that we're having this debate. I think there's a lot of different areas within there that we could unpack individually. Yep. But overall, we sort of welcome the reforms and welcome looking at our governance regime as part of that.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Kim. And then turning to you, Michael, I guess that kind of broad view in terms of, the effectiveness that you would see and your members see in terms of the Manchester speech. And I understand you were at another an event recently with HM Treasury, indeed perhaps even this morning, to try and get VC funds capital into the economy. So your perspectives on those issues would be really interesting to hear.
Well, allow me, if I may, to say thanks to Adrian and responsible asset owners for fostering this debate, and because I think that things like the Edinburgh Reforms can easily be something that is thrown out, as Kimberly was saying, there's 40 or 50 different strands to it, and then nobody ever thinks of it again. If I'm allowed to mention the B word, as in Brexit, post-Brexit, there have been a lot of things polite company one doesn't discuss, but what I think the government was rightly needing to signal to the UK, but to global investors, is that we might no longer be part of the European Union, but we're going to maintain global standards. We don't want, this is not a Singapore-on-Thames shuffle, and that nevertheless we wanted competitiveness to be at the heart of where we were. So we would take the opportunity to look at things afresh, and there's a lot to work through. I also think the second, if that was first signal, the second signal was to everybody, actually, it's time to have a fresh look at the way things are constructed at the moment, the way they're set up. There's a lot of stuff that is set in stone. And the bit you'd not be surprised at all to hear that I'm very enthusiastic about is the drive to look and see how two major public policy challenges and opportunities, to keep positive, can be addressed through some of these reforms. On the first side, how do you get better returns, particularly for DC pension savers who are on track at the moment for potentially a not very exciting outcome based on the way the model has developed thus far? Open to debate that statement, I know, but that's certainly one of the considerations. And the second thing is to pick up the other point is, how do we get more UK sourced capital into the so-called real or so-called productive economy, so that we can drive two things. One, the great opportunities that the United Kingdom has in areas like life sciences, deep tech, covering a whole range of topics, AI now very topical, clean tech, which obviously is at the heart of kind of mindset of people in this kind of forum. How do you do all of that, given the UK a leadership position, or build on the leadership position where its universities and early stage businesses are, but beyond that, help the rest of the economy to adapt? Because I don't care whether you're in the business, or I do care, but I mean, you can get quite obsessed with the solutions side of this. How are we going to solve climate things? How are we going to address this? But you have to rewire and transform the entirety of the economy to make sure that it's fit for the energy transition, it's decarbonised, it remains internationally competitive, and while AI is eating all of our jobs without us necessarily understanding it. It's just a slightly exaggerated statement, but understand the sentiment. So all of that has got to be good. Where I've come from this morning, literally walked along from Mansion House to here, is the Pension Summit, where the Chancellor and the Lord Mayor were following up on the announcement made in the Mansion House speech in July that 9 major institutions had now committed to put 5% of their default funds under management into unlisted securities by 2030. So 9 had committed at the time. Aon joined to become the 10th this morning. For our part, in the venture capital and growth equity world, yesterday we met at the Treasury with Gareth Davis, the Exchequer Secretary, and we signed the Venture Capital Investment Compact. 20 firms, 25 billion AUM, who are committed to basically bridging the gap between where the biggest financial institutions in the UK sit at the moment and where they sit, and making sure that our structures, our approaches are fit for purpose. But all of that then plays into lots of other things. Just last thing I would say, if I may, Oscar, is that one of the things we were debating this morning, or just reassuring people about, is our model. I mean, we've got Railpen and Schroders as very active members of our industry, as well as lots of other industries. Our model is about good governance. It's about responsible investing, because frankly, if you're an active owner, you don't have any choice but to do that. If you're going to navigate what's happening over the next 3 or 4 years, you have got to be on it with all the things that are changing the way the world is and the way society expects business to behave. And not only that, you've got to be ready to hand on a business to somebody else 5, 7 years down the line, who can also see a growth trajectory that takes account of all these things as well.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rico. So back to you, Caroline. I mean, how optimistic do you think all these voluntary compacts will be? Obviously, there's been a lot of media interest and political interest in these voluntary compacts. Yeah, I guess how optimistic are you that these sorts of things will, deliver on the objectives of government, but also on pension scheme savers as well?
I think, as I said, voluntary is the right way to go. I look forward to seeing how the conversation around liquidity develops, for instance. I look forward to seeing how the conversation around trustee education as well delivers on the quality advice, of course, that most pension schemes receive. I think more broadly, we're at risk of making the problem worse with some of the proposals that have come out in terms of the listings review. I said this before, and there'll be people in the audience, I'm aware, who are aware of our views on this. We engage a lot with pre-IPO companies in the US and the UK. And we know that thriving capital markets need to be attractive to companies. They need to be attractive to investors. And it's a virtuous circle. And the companies tell us that when it comes to thinking about where it is that they're going to be listing, the governance, and some people in the media can call it the governance burden, but the governance and the regulations and so on are actually not one of the priority things that they're looking at. And this is borne out, by the way, by this very good UK finance and Ernst & Young report that came out a few months ago. What they're looking for is a liquid pool of high quality capital that really gets them. Investors are looking for protections, robust investor protections. And yes, the US has fewer sort of hard corporate governance regulations and so on. But they also benefit from having a very strong courts-based system, as the FCA sort of said. Yep. We have the UK Corporate Governance Code, which is wonderful, but soft law isn't necessarily the same as having hard shareholder rights and so on. And so I worry that we are risking making the UK capital markets less attractive to investors, which in turn will make the UK less attractive to companies, and so on. So it might actually exacerbate the decline. And we recognise that there are potentially things in terms of the corporate governance regulatory environment that might change, but rolling back some of the investor protections, some of the really hardcore investor protections, and I'm talking about voting rights over related party transactions or significant transactions, and I'm talking about a more permissive approach to dual class share structures, does not to us feel like the right way to pursue what the UK government wants to see and what ultimately we as a UK asset owner want to see as well.
Okay, thanks. Kim, then perhaps Michael, but yes, I'm you, Kim. Yeah, I guess let's turn the conversation to the listings reforms that Caroline's mentioned. And I guess, do we think this is going to really address some of the constraints that all stakeholders identified in terms of trying to get companies to choose to list here, and companies that are already listed here to continue to kind of raise capital and expand their operations?
Sure. So I think it's really difficult to talk about these things en masse, right? Because it is these reforms are we've Schroders has also been public about our views. There's 20, 30 different kind of items within listing reforms, which across shares, related parties, strategic party transactions. And I think it's really difficult to sort of make blanket statements about them. But what I would say is that look, there's a divergence of views in the investment community. Right? We're investors, and the way that we think about this is that it's not. I think sort of the debate about whether or not governance is important, or whether or not we should have a strong governance regime, or whether or not good governance matters to companies is, that's not really the question, right? There's no investor who would want to acquire, to hold a poorly governed company. I think the question really is where should the decisions about what good governance looks like lay? Should it lay with regulators in an overly prescriptive environment, or should it lay with investors who must have access to good information, good quality information, and must be under a reasonably, there should be a reasonable governance framework. But I think the question really isn't, whether or not governance is important, or whether or not we want to have high quality governed companies, but whether or not we think we are heading in the direction of being overly prescriptive with what we prescribe, and who's in a better position to assess and make investment decisions based upon the quality of management. And as a stewardship team, we believe, and we do engage with many, many pre-IPO companies, and we find those conversations to be very useful to us, and the feedback that we get is very useful to the companies as well. And we think that that's a better way, generally, of encouraging good, strong governance. We believe in letting the markets and the investors make those calls based upon access to quality information.
Michael, any thoughts on listings reforms and the importance of good governance, both in public and private markets?
Look, we are very keen that the whole kind of system is seen in the round. I think historically, and it might yet be the case in certain quarters, there's a little bit of an us and them between public markets and private markets. But in truth, in our industry, we've everybody from the smallest emerging manager that's just been set up by whoever with relatively small AUM, all the way through the venture capital world through growth equity and onto the largest buyout groups in the world who have a UK or European presence. So we've got the full representative. So we've got people who will take businesses private, but they will often not then look to bring things back to the market in due course. We've got people who start off with, I guess it's not garden sheds anymore, but they start with an idea and they in the lab or wherever, and they take it through, and then the ones that get it listed. I think separately, the Capital Markets Industry Task Force that's been looking at all these great issues is, again, I think that's a really healthy part of the debate. In an ideal world, we've got a fully functioning system that allows people not to be put off by governance requirements on the markets, particularly. Although if they think going private is a way of avoiding governance, they'll have another thing, a rude awakening when they see. I mean, a lot of this is people. You got two levels. That you got the fund manager sitting on boards, really actively engaged with the businesses that the fund has invested in, and you've got institutional investors on the back of those investment managers, okay, they're looking for data and follow-up and all that kind of stuff too, and which is where the broader responsible asset ownership piece comes, because increasingly a lot of that debate is around sustainability and the like, and how that sits with the broader framework. I think there's a lot of frustration. I don't think it's unique to public markets or private markets. There's a lot of frustration about I guess just the early stages we are at, relatively speaking, still in terms of ESG reporting and the broader agenda. That's more and more complex. The standards aren't yet quite settled. The reporting requirements aren't quite settled. And there's a lot of naturally jibbing against new stuff that comes in. We're going to have to find a way of doing that. But I think that's as much an issue for private markets as it is for public.
Agreed. I think we will turn to ESG and responsible investing in a little bit. But before that, Caroline, maybe any other thoughts on kind of Kim and Michael's points around kind of good governance and listings as well?
Yes. So I would say that the investor community, there's maybe less divergence than one might think on the UK listings review. You look at the UKSIF response, you look at the IA, the PLSA, the Investor Forum, and the asset owner community generally. And we and many others were very public about our dissatisfaction with the CP 2310 UK listings rules proposals. And I think we're actually, most of us, speaking with one voice on this. The other thing I would say is that the US as a market has certain fundamental advantages just in terms of scale, number of investors, and the existence of tech firms there already, that in many ways it will be impossible for the UK to emulate. So should we really be trying to be a watered down version of Wall Street? Or should we do what we've always done, which is celebrate and revel in our USP as the world's quality market, where a listing on the premium segment, conscious we're thinking about moving to a single segment regime, where a listing on the premium segment is the imprimatur of quality and really sought after. And Lord Hill in his initial review noted that the prestige of market was a really important criterion when it comes to firms deciding where it is that they want to list. So shouldn't we be doing that, making the case more forcefully for this USP than watering down protections and in a sort of misguided attempt to emulate the US, which we can never really hope to do.
Kim, I don't know if you'd like to come in, and then maybe also touch on what are the other factors as well that kind of, I guess, re-energize UK capital markets. And I think there's some really good recommendations in the report that Caroline mentioned from UK Finance and EY a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's suggesting we emulate the US. I think, to borrow a phrase from the Hill Review, right? There's no sense in having a theoretically perfect listing regime if nobody's listing on it. So I think we can't ignore the figures. We can't ignore. I certainly am not sort of stating or implying that there is just one reason, that it's just governance. There are a plethora, but I think that we would be. I think the responsible thing to do is to really question every element of it, and whether or not, particularly in governance, we have layers on top layers upon layers upon layers and upon layers, and whether this has become a house that's gotten so many layers of paint over it. Maybe it's time to strip it a bit and look at what's really, really kind of necessary and fundamental. And I think it's a reasonable sort of posture to have, given what the numbers are showing us.
We might have a slightly different perspective from both Kim and Caroline here, although I think it's complementary to it rather than contradictory. Back to the Mansion House process, this year's Mansion House process that we're very enthusiastically signed up to. 10, 20 years ago, the issue for us was getting startup finance. I mean, I recall, if you go back to the GFC and the response after that, there was a massive cry, we need finance, we've got credit crunch, what's going on? And the cry was on. But I remember it was very much a debt-focused discussion. Equity and risk kind of assets were not necessarily, although I think the creation of the BGF, British Growth Fund, from the big clearing banks, the creation of the British Business Bank, in the coalition, full disclosure, I was part of the coalition government at the time. Those began to address some of those areas. I think we can, not particularly because of those areas of innovations, but we've got a much healthier startup kind of world in the UK now. Our universities are much more tuned in. So we've got a pipeline, which is great. There are investable opportunities, address some of the big policy challenges I mentioned at the start. But our issue now is scale up. How do you bridge from one to the other? And then what's very encouraging, and we find this when we go to North America or other parts of the world to promote what's available in the UK, a lot of North American VC and private equity funds now look at the UK and go, oh, right, both as a base to access the UK, but more widely Europe, this is a great place to be, we'll do it. But they then end up on the kind of cap table, and when it comes to the next stage of where should you list, what should you do, it's a lot easier to say, well, it's all Americans on this list, why don't we cross over and come to NASDAQ or wherever it might be. That's a gross set of generalizations there, but I think illustrative of a broader point that finding the bridge through that is huge. So getting some of the DC pension capital, that will matter. But what is interesting to us, although we're not massively engaged in it, but we're certainly valuing the discussions we're having, is things like the intermittent trading venue as a stepping stone to the full market and so on. That kind of creativity, that kind of innovation, whether that's the right solution or otherwise, there'll be greater expertise in the audience than I have. But I think it is another part of this puzzle solving. How do we get something that works for everybody without necessarily diluting standards? So can we get the Goldilocks place where it's just right?
Yeah, indeed, that right balance in place. Kim, any comments in response, or Caroline? But no worries if not. We might turn to ESG that you brought up, Michael, earlier, and responsible investment, which was a key theme in the Edinburgh Reforms announced last year. I think I know the answer to this question already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Caroline, to what extent do you think the ambitions are outlined in the Edinburgh Reforms in terms of UK leadership on sustainability have been taken forward since?
Yes, you do already know the response because we supported one of the letters that UKSIF had written on this. So, markets are about perception and sentiment, and the pronouncements of politicians matter and are paid attention to by investors, domestically, internationally, by companies, pre-IPO companies, listed companies, and so on. And certainly, some of the stuff that was announced about the ambition to be a global leader in sustainable finance sounded brilliant, but some of the pronouncements that have been made since around net zero by senior politicians is maybe a bit unhelpful. We've already spoken about the UK listing review, but I'd actually point to some of the broader corporate governance steps that have been taken since then, and particularly last week's decision to roll back to council some of the really interesting, important, and I think useful reforms that had been put in place, that had been proposed and were being taken forward to try to boost trust in corporate governance and audit. So no longer having triennial audit and assurance policies, no longer having resilience statements and so on. And corporate governance is intimately involved. You cannot have influence on environmental and social issues. You cannot have a well-run company, sort of as Kimberly was saying, without good corporate governance. And making these kinds of statements and having these kinds of policy signals out, I think, are really problematic.
And then, Michael, turning to you, if that's okay, you talked a bit about the kind of ESG reporting burden that you're kind of seeing out there.
Did I say burden? Oh, shit, I'll be...
Oh, no, sorry, that's probably my language.
Opportunities.
That's my language I might have interjected. But in any case, I think the kind of this idea that I think, there's
the evolving picture, I think, is...
It is that is perhaps would be more accurate. But I guess on that, I guess there is this sort of seeming sense that, have we gone too far in terms of all these corporate disclosures, these ESG requirements? So yeah, really interesting your take on that. And then also the same question I posed to Caroline in terms of kind of UK leadership on sustainable investing more generally.
Another deep, dark secret, having identified myself as a recovering politician. Actually, no, fully recovered. I'm totally out of it. On the one hand, my earlier career, I'm a recovered auditor. It was so long ago I trained with Coopers and Lybrand. And I remember, the analogy may not be entirely fair, but somebody's saying it's taken 100-odd years to get financial statements and disclosures to the point of maturity they've reached now. And we're trying to short circuit, fast track, whatever the appropriate cliche is, all of the ESG type reporting in a time frame that's nothing like that. We're a bit smarter, we're a bit more experienced, so I guess it's not entirely analogous. I think the key point is, if we think we've reached the end of the point where we know everything that we're going to have to measure, everybody knows how to do carbon footprints through to plotting how their strategies will deliver on the decarb. I mean, no, I don't think everybody's really going to claim that. So I think, painful as it is, we're going to have to accept this is going to be a bit of an uncomfortable journey along the way. I was just talking to my colleagues earlier on. We've just done the latest stage in developing responsible investing toolkits and the like, and giving guides to members so that they understand what it is they're trying to measure, what it is they're trying to do, where is that great mass of demands that are placed upon us, where's that reached, and how do we work our way through it? Because there's an active ownership model that is at the heart of our industry. We're a bit allergic to making big commitments about something 10, 20 years in the future, because everybody's kind of going, well, hang on, I'm day to day, I'm responsible for overseeing the management team that's actually got to go there. How to do that practically? So there's a lot of that. So it will be burdensome. It's a pain in the whatevers that there's so many different things. I've said the word burden. Sorry, I apologize. I recant. But if we just put broader mind about it and say we're on a journey, and we've got to use our smarts to get to the end point quickly, then we'll be fine. What we could do without, and this picks up the earlier point, is a sense that the journey might be aborted, or that we might be diverted in a way that's not helpful. And there's lots of debate around what was said about net zero and so on, and the tactical political considerations that come into it. I don't think anybody seriously would suggest that we're about to stop and start being deniers that we've got to address all these issues.
Just a bit of a last point, Michael, in terms of the kind of, the broader kind of net zero policy environment in the UK. And as much as you can say, what's been the reaction from yourself and members that you've spoken to? Is this already seemingly impacting investment decisions, and perhaps even putting at risk kind of the UK as a kind of centre of excellence for investment?
I could get myself in a lot of trouble here. It's not for me to try and interpret what the Prime Minister did or did not say. On the other hand, there was a bit of a contrast between his statement about let's think seriously about have we actually reached a point where we can credibly keep to that commitment on the one hand, and the actual underlying regulations and everything else, which seem not to have changed. So there's a kind of but I think the signalling point that Caroline picked up before is really, really, really important. And the danger is that however tactical it might have appeared to some, or however important it was to others, if it does suggest a pausing, a slowing down, a diversion, even an aborting of the process, then that is very problematic. I mean, we've been talking to ministers and others over the last couple of years, but particularly in the last few months, as they are more and more focused on these compacts. So you've got three essential elements you need to have. You need to have a credible UK industry, which is at the centre of what we're talking about here with Edinburgh Reforms, tick, and that can grow. And we're, in our industry, we are the largest ecosystem of private capital, expertise, anywhere in the world outside the United States of America. So that's some pretty useful to us, because it both helps you make smart investment decisions, but it's of itself a useful, credible thing. So you got that investment. You need them to be credible internationally in pulling in the allocations of capital from either home base on the east coast of America or in Asia, wherever it might be, or the continent. And if your standards have got to be good, but not too onerous. And then the third thing is you need to have investable propositions. And that's driven by particular issues around climate or whatever it might be. If you're going to really, everybody here is thinking not 3 months, 6 months, they're thinking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You've got to have confidence there's a framework that will survive your own administration, but actually hopefully have consensus to get into another administration, should that come along. And that kind of statement is difficult because it pulls a thread at the confidence that such a policy framework will last.
And Kim, from your perspective, I mean, would you agree with thoughts from Mike and Caroline just now in terms of the kind of importance of getting the right signals to the investment community on UK commitments to net zero?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, we're long-only investors. Our responsibility to our clients is to generate long-term sustainable financial returns. I think it's indisputable that social and environmental forces are fundamentally shaping our economy, which impacts the resilience of companies, which impacts their long-term sustainability and ultimately long-term sustainable returns. We need access to this information. We need to understand how company and managements are thinking. I completely agree, but governance is important. And in order to assess governance, we need information. We need to know how management is thinking about net zero. We need an understanding of the regulatory environment that they're operating under. We need to understand how prepared they are to transition. We need to understand how they're adapting. We need to understand how they're thinking about how climate change will impact their business. This is a fundamental part of our company analysis process. And without that information, so yes, we speak to companies every day. We have engage over 5,000 companies a year. We're very actively involved. We hear from listed equities about various reporting requirements, and and it's becoming box ticking. And we, as investors, do have a responsibility to only request the most material information and explain why it's material and sort of our thinking around it. We should be transparent. However, we fundamentally need access to information about how management are thinking about managing these risks. And it is wholly fundamental to our investment process.
Thank you. Actually, it was actually sort of, before we went on to the next question or audience questions or whatever it was, just to Michael's point, which I thought was a good one, sort of signalling versus policy, and to flag that there's still some good stuff happening on the policy front, and I particularly focus on the FCA's vote reporting group work, which is all about actually, Kimberly, you were talking about information being good. It's all about actually the information from the asset managers as opposed to the issuers, and making sure that flow goes through to asset owners, who are the closest and most closely aligned beneficiaries. And then also the task force on social factors as well. Of course, Oscar, that UKSIF was involved in Railpen, I should point out for clarity's sake, also sat on the task force. So there's some interesting stuff still burbling away, but it's that policy versus signal.
I was going to interject. I mean, do we think that kind of the policy successes that is that almost counteracted by the rhetoric that we're getting from the Prime Minister and ministers? Because it does seem like ministers at the cabinet table are saying quite positive things in terms of the commitments to net zero by 2050, boosting and getting investment into the clean growth sectors of the future. And then the Prime Minister comes up and makes that speech a few weeks ago, and it's something very different to what kind of ministers apparently have been sort of saying to businesses. So yeah, how do you react to that? And then also just to also say, please do get your questions across to us through the Slido app. And I think Adrian will have a few questions for us. But yeah, Caroline, and then maybe the questions.
All I will say to add to what I was already saying is that he is the Prime Minister, and what he says matters. Yeah, and I'll leave it there.
Great. Any thoughts on that question as well?
I think it does. Colin's absolutely right. It does matter. I'm too old to be naive, but I'm kind of hoping it was very much a tactical consideration. Dare I say it was a reaction to a by-election result that suggested one course of action might be appropriate. There have been subsequent by-elections, and it doesn't seem to have cut much mustard there. And I think it's genuinely, when you talk to ministers and we've had the party conference season and we've had the opposition setting out their stall. This is absolutely fundamental to our future. And the Chancellor this morning is talking about clean tech and getting the investment required for the grid to get it. I think that it was unhelpful, but I don't think, my interpretation is it's not yet a major change of direction. But there's an ugly reality that there's an election coming up and people will look for tactical advantage.
Indeed.
And that's politics.
Great. Kim, any thoughts on the subject before we turn to questions?
No, I don't
Right.
disagree with
Great. I think we got some questions from Adrian. Thank you.
So that was always good. It's right, I've got this one now, it's now working. The question that's coming is, how do you see the Edinburgh Reforms landscape evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? Because you talked about it being and everything in this industry being an evolutionary process, and it is. So what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years? Bit of a crystal ball thing, but tell us.
I genuinely hope that on this there will be a kind of cross-party consensus and people with energy in key positions to keep it going. I mean, I recall from my own experience, but I see it firsthand now, the convening power of the Treasury to make statements, get people in a room, summon them back for a progress report, say we're going to legislate if this doesn't work out that way. That is hugely important. So there might be tweaks and twists in the journey, but I'm pretty confident that that broad-based, maybe it's too amorphous a statement, but global standards that allow us to establish a competitive position, that will drive policy, I think, for some time.
Great, thanks. Kim, I don't know if you have any thoughts about a long-term picture, but thought Caroline.
Okay, please.
Yes, so I think consolidation will continue to happen, particularly in the DC bit of the market. And I should probably flag, I'm also a trustee at a DC pension scheme, so I sort of see that bit of it as well. So I can see that continuing to happen, encouraged by some of the things that have already been discussed and some of the many things that have been proposed and will no doubt continue. I think we will continue to see progress in terms of how pension schemes en masse think about value for money. And I think that sometimes, people are right when they say that there needs to be more focus on value and thinking about the returns and performance that you get for a certain level of cost and not being too narrowly focused on the cost side of things. I would hope that policymakers, regulators will listen to the investor community when they talk about the importance of maintaining corporate governance. That's UK listings review. Whether or not this will happen, but I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. And I have to say, we've been really pleased with the level of engagement from the FCA, from Treasury, from others. So it does seem like they are looking to listen to investors when we talk about our concerns.
Great. I don't know if we have any other questions, but perhaps time for one more question and then leave it at.
What do you see as the most significant challenges or uncertainties that you'll face in the coming year?
Wow, that's a broad question.
Goodness.
I'm so glad you got that.
Look, there's a lot going on right now, regulatorily. There's sort of long-term prospects, which I just, who knows? It was a question I was interested to hear your answer about. But sort of in the shorter term, I'd say I'm really interested to see what is the FRC, what is the FCA, what is going to be the outcome, what is the governance code going to look like, what is the stewardship code going to look like, what is the market going to say, what are, how are flows going to shift as a result of Mansion House, and so I think there are a lot of question marks, and I think that's part of what we, ESG is that. How are flows going to look like there? What are consumer demands and expectations going to look like of our clients? So I think what we are really cognizant of are all of this sort of open questions right now and changes about the future, which is why it's important that we are constantly engaging with our key stakeholders because it's evolving. We regularly engage our institutional investor clients on kind of their priorities and what they're concerned about and what they want us to focus on. And the change in our response year on year is really, really significant. So I think it just really underscores the importance of continuing to sort of monitor your key stakeholders because we're just seeing a lot of change in the space right now.
One final question, please, Michael. Scale up in deep tech is driven by large company collaboration with startups. Is the UK seeking to position better, i.e. encouraging more corporate venture investments?
Yeah, corporate venture is hugely important, and it has a very important place in what will answer that scale-up gap. We need that as much as we need the other bits of the jigsaw that we talked about before.
Great. I think we all. Oh, I think there's one question at the front. If we could take that, perhaps, and then I think we'll have to leave it there. I think. Thanks.
It does seem to me that we've got sort of 5 headwinds we have to actually deal with over the next few years to make all this happen, both government and the industry. The first one is I'm not totally convinced, and Railpen I'm sure is an exception to this. I'm not convinced that the sources of long-term capital, particularly in the DB industry, which is principally the local authority funds, have the expertise to be able to oversee and monitor venture capital. Secondly, when I was chairman of Scottish Financial Enterprise, which Michael, you'll be aware of as the trade body in Scotland, I did actually try to bring the Baillie Giffords and others to the universities, and I met terrible headwinds. Extraordinarily enough, most of them from the Edinburgh University, where the professors said, look, we're not into monetizing, we're into writing papers. The one successful university, strangely enough, was Dundee, which is about the most left-wing city in Scotland. But you've got a headwind there. Thirdly, I'm not sure how you scale this up in order to be able to provide the returns that institutional investors will need over the time scale that they need to get them. And the final one is we are desperately short of funds, long-term funds in this country. We've killed off DB schemes, pretty much. DC schemes are fragmented beyond belief. And the only way we can make that work is using default funds, in which case the government or the regulators have got to remove the charge cap to the extent that a DC fund is invested in private equity or venture capital. 75 basis points won't crack it. And I heard them say
They have.
I didn't know they'd actually done it, but I did hear say they were going to do it.
It was a kind of, this is only in our world was this exciting, which is why nowhere else did it get attention. Finally, after years of effort, it was legislated for earlier this year.
But they have to find a way of consolidating DC funds.
Yeah, and in fairness, that takes me back to where I started my day. There is a big push. I expect we will hear from the Chancellor in his autumn statement a lot more about consolidation. I think also simultaneous to all of this work, Andrew Williamson, who's the managing partner of Cambridge Innovation Capital, along with the Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, been running basically a review of all the spin-out operations of the UK's universities. Dundee has got a great track record, and I think now we must tempt you back to show you that all other universities are doing well there. I think you've touched on a great range of problems that are not by any means solved,
No.
But I am a bit more confident, maybe I'm paid to be confident on this, but I'm certainly more optimistic that we're on a journey that's picking up speed.
I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to get the DWP to do, sorry, I do apologize.
No, just to respond to a couple of the points that you raised. So,
And just say, I think Caroline, you will have the last word. Kim, would you like to come in?
I'm happy.
Great. Well, I think Caroline, you will have the last words, and then we don't want to keep people. And then I think we've got a coffee break after that. But yeah, Caroline with the final word.
Thank you. So 2 points, 2 final words that I wanted to make in response to your points. So obviously, I don't work in the LGPS, but I engage with them, collaborate with many colleagues, responsible investment colleagues in the LGPS fund world, including the pools and so on. And there is expertise there, but we can agree to disagree on that. The second piece that I do agree with you more on is the DB funds, the DB funding, the the fact that Railpen, Railways Pension Scheme, is unusual in still being an open DB scheme. And we are worried that the way in which the DB funding code seems to be going will actually make it harder for those genuinely open schemes that are still investing in productive finance, productive assets and venture capital and so on, to continue to do so, to continue to take that risk-oriented mindset. Because at the moment, there is not yet enough space or a carve-out for genuinely open schemes to not be categorized alongside all the other DB schemes and encouraged to go towards what they call low dependency. So if we want to continue to protect these large pools of capital like Railpen, like the other few open DB schemes, then we hope that that is a change that will happen.
Great. I think we will have to leave it there. I'm afraid we're definitely running over time, which does happen. But yeah, huge thank you to Caroline, Kim, and Michael for joining me on this panel. Really enjoyed this discussion.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. And I think we've got a coffee break coming up now. So yeah, thanks very much.